We'll start with your dad. I actually have his book right here about inflation.
Did I sign that one?
Yeah, yes, you did. Yes, I appreciate that. And I was just wondering, not just the education your dad gave you, obviously, as somebody that has been a huge advocate against inflation, but the principles he instilled in you. Can you talk a little bit about your dad and what it was like for you and Andrew growing up with him?
Yeah, well, he was very dedicated to what he believed in, and he believed very passionately in it. I think he was a real American. He was a patriot. Unfortunately, he died as a political prisoner. But he really tried to, expose the corruption in government, not just in the federal government, but in the court system, and really was an advocate for the Constitution, individual liberty, and the principles that the country was founded on. He was also very smart when it came to economics. Really well schooled, self-taught. Not he went to college, but he didn't learn Austrian economics at UConn where he went to college. He kind of learned it on his own, and he testified in 1968. They had hearings on whether or not they should remove gold backing from the dollar. They ultimately didn't do it until 1971, but the law that authorized the president to do it was passed earlier, while Johnson was president. And my father testified, and his testimony he reproduced in his book, The Biggest Con, which people can still get copies of. I mean, used. There's not that many new ones around. But his testimony is the only one that stood up because gold was $35 an ounce at the time, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the Secretary of the Treasury testified that the price of gold would go down if they removed backing. They said that the dollar was supporting gold, and without the dollar propping up gold, gold would be worth less than $35 an ounce. And my father said no, the gold price will go way up, but he also predicted all of the inflation of the 1970s. And the other experts said no, there won't. They didn't see the inflation coming at all. So he understood economics, understood law, the Constitution, and he really did a good job educating me from a young age, so that I would understand those principles too.
Yeah, that's great. What was that like with his prison sentence and everything? How long did he serve? And I know there are issues with him getting proper medical care and, being moved around the country, I believe. What was that experience like?
Well, he was in and out of prison several times. The first time was only 6 months, or I think he only served 4.5, 6 month sentence. It was a misdemeanor the first time. The next time he got, I think, 3 years. But then every time he got out, they would claim he violated his parole or his probation, and so he would go in and out of jail for a while. Then he was finished with that, and then the last time he got convicted of tax evasion, he ended up getting like a 13-year sentence. And by the time he got the sentence, he was in his mid to late 70s. So he wasn't going to get released until he was about 90, or maybe it was 70 when he went in, or 70, I forget, 90, 92. But he died in prison at 87, so he still had a few years left to go. But when he was 80, when he turned 80, so for the first few years, he was in a prison camp. They call him a federal correction camp. And the one he was in was only about an hour and a half drive from my house. And so I'd visit him a lot. I'd take my kids there. But when he got to be 80, they said, "Oh, you're too old. You need to be in a facility that has better medical care." So they transferred him to Indiana. Then they transferred him to Houston. But basically, he got no medical care at all because he ended up getting a skin cancer, and they didn't treat it, diagnose it. So it ended up, spreading, and he died of lung cancer about 3 months after they gave him 4 months to live. But during those 3 months, we were trying to get the Bureau of Prisons and the government to let him out, just compassionate release, so he could die, with his family. But they wouldn't let him out. And in fact, I remember when we were in the hospital room where he died, I got another call about how the paperwork was working through the system. I said, "Don't bother. He's going to be dead here in an hour," because they took he was breathing through a tube.
Yeah, that's
But the worst
terrible.
part about it was he was shackled to his bed with an armed guard in his room, and he was barely conscious, and he was breathing out of this thing that they shoved down your lungs because his lungs didn't work anymore. And I'm sure he was conscious. I could hold his hand and I could talk to him, but I'm sure he felt the pain of that handcuff on his ankle, and they wouldn't remove it. And the armed guard, well, that's the rules. He has to be handcuffed. I'm like, but he can't move. He can't leave the bed. He couldn't even leave the bed to go to the bathroom, right? He was hooked up to these things so he could, pee without, lying. So, but they still have him handcuffed. That's how ridiculous the government bureaucracy is. But they basically killed him too, because he was in good health when he went in. I mean, he had some cataracts. He was like blinding in one eye. But like his last months in prison were so bad because there's a phone system that you would use to make outgoing phone calls at prison. It was inexpensive. They really stick it to the family members of the prisoners, because even though they had cheap phones and internet back then, you couldn't really use it without going through these government systems. We're a private system, but they really gouge everybody because you don't have any choice. And the government gives out these contracts to their buddies, so they're ripping off the families of the inmates. But my father's voice was changing because of his cancer. And so for like the last, month or two, he couldn't even make any calls because the voice recognition system didn't recognize him. And so, we couldn't even talk to him. So it was just really bad. But I mean, it just, the government is really heartless and criminal because they kept him in jail as a political prisoner to send a message to other people. Hey, you better pay your taxes because, you're going to end up in jail like Schiff.
So you mentioned tax evasion. How did he view it? What was his justification?
For what? For not paying taxes?
Yeah. Because he had an argument, right? That he didn't believe they passed it constitutionally or something to that effect.
Yeah. Well, I put up on my YouTube channel, I put up some of my father's videos. I put up recently one. He explains in front of a fire. It's like a 2-hour discussion, and he's talking about it. We have a website called shiftbooks.com, and I've been selling my father's book, The Federal Mafia. So you can get a copy of that. I autograph it. We sell the Kingdom of Malts there too, which is what you got. Mm-hmm. But you can read and really understand my father's perspective, and why he believed that. And, most people I've talked to, especially even judges, lawyers, they say your father's right. They agree with him, right? So it's not like he was even wrong. It's the government that's wrong. It's the courts that are wrong. But, they couldn't afford to allow him to be right. So they tried to discredit him by putting him in jail. But just like, Galileo, he went to jail because he said the earth orbited the sun. He obviously wasn't wrong, but, the church didn't want anybody to know that. So they put him in jail to discredit him. So he must be wrong. So he's in jail. So, and that's what they did with my dad. He wasn't, smart as Galileo, but it was just, it's the same principle, how governments put people in jail to kind of prove a point and, and to scare people. But, one of the books that I wrote with my brother, How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes, was based on a book my dad wrote and that we got a kick out of as a kid, How an Economy Grows and Why It Doesn't. So, there's a lot of influence. And, my dad had a great sense of humor. I think, I got some of that. I mean, he was a good talker, he did, so I think I inherited, I don't know if I'm as good as my father was. Because he used to tell my brother, I used to make up fantastic stories. I don't have the imagination that he had. He would just on the cuff would tell us these intricate, stories. And they were almost like, chapters, because every time we were around, we'd tell us more of the story. And so the story was like always ongoing and evolving. And he never knew how it was going to end because he made up these stories, as he went along. So he was always interested to find out.
That's a lost art.
Yeah, he would be like, how does it end? He goes, I don't know. I'm interested to find out, because he didn't know how it was going to end because he hadn't made it up yet.